Hey, welcome to the Fabric Culture Podcast. I'm Desmond Broadway, I'm an image consultant and model based in Dallas, Texas. And I'm here with Ty.
That would be me. Well, yeah, my name is Ty. I'm a photographer here in the Dallas Fort Worth area. I'm known for my very unique photography style, which you're probably going to find out over the next, hour. I do a lot of cinematic photography. I go to a lot of unique places. Have a very unique style that I love to share with the world. So I'm happy to get into it. I'm happy with the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, I love your style, man. So, how'd you get into photography?
Good question. About 2.5 years ago, around the early part of 2021, I had a falling out with my family, unfortunately. So I moved to the DFW. I got a job. Yeah, I got a job and stuff like that. But for me though, I needed something important or meaningful to do in my spare time. So like a lot of people, I got my stimulus check. I was like, oh, I could either save this money or I could not save the money and buy myself a camera. So I went ahead and just bought myself a camera. I didn't really know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that I needed to take some better pictures from my Tinder account. Needed to go out take some pictures for my friends and stuff like that too. So because of that, I got a camera and eventually I was like, oh, I want to do something unique. I want to stand out. I want to have like a goal or a path towards, being unique when it comes to photography. Because, there's a lot of people out there who take pictures in parks, take pictures in studios, perfectly acceptable. But I was like, I want to do something that you don't see that often. So I started doing, nighttime photography, started going out shooting in places like arcades. And I think that that was cool, but at the same time, because of how, difficult those conditions can be with, low lighting and, just you don't have a lot of control over the elements in the situation. It forced me to become a better editor and a better photographer I guess you say more quickly than maybe some other people who just shoot in, you know, sunsets and stuff like that. So yeah, I decided to get into photography just to have something meaningful and productive to do during a pretty difficult part of my life. And it grew into something, huge and big. And so
So,
yeah.
really, it's only been 3 years. How'd you improve your editing so quickly?
Yeah, what I've always told people is that it's easy to become better as a editor or even as a photographer if you have a clear path towards what you want to do. So I think what often happens is that people want to become better in a craft, let's say like photography, but there's so many different things you can do to become a better photographer. Like say you want to become more confident in a certain editing style or you want to shoot in certain locations. And because of that, you can get very overwhelmed, very confused. You don't really know where to start. I think that what really helped me to become better pretty fast as I knew very clearly what I wanted to be. I had a certain vision. I had certain things that inspired me. So because of that, I knew what I wanted my photos to look like. So I had a clear path towards where I wanted to go. So I was able to identify what specific editing skills I needed to become more confident in that. And because of that, I just spent a lot of days just watching YouTube videos, just spending 5 to 10 minutes learning how to edit in this style, how to make my images look better in this style, learning how to use different programs and resources. So I would say like, if you have a clear vision and if you have a clear inspiration for what motivates you artistically, it's a lot easier to become a lot more skilled because you know what you're growing into instead of just jumping to a craft and not knowing where you're headed. So for me, I always had a lot of passions when it came to like anime, when it came to like low light, cyberpunk, stuff like that. Because I grew up in Japan, I grew up in Korea, so I grew up in those like urban neon landscapes, stuff like that too. And I think that those types of situations always spoke to me. So I think that going into becoming a photographer, I knew that I wanted to dabble in that type of photography, and because of that, I knew where to go. And I did my due diligence at the beginning. Spent hours watching YouTube videos, a lot of trial and error, and yeah, still have a lot to learn, but I think I've, made it pretty far in a relatively short amount of time.
So, with your vision, it was basically like that nightlife, like street life vision. So, how did you focus on that to where it pops? Because I know it's like a lot of your
Hmm.
stuff, it I've seen people who attempt to do like that neon where the light's actually popping,
Hmm.
but how did you make it, I don't know, so vivid?
Yeah. So, what was interesting too is like how to make any image, vivid. It's not something you even have to be a photographer to learn how to do. It's something you can do when you're even not a photographer. So when I was watching videos on how to edit, one of my main goals when I was getting into photography was to avoid my images looking flat or making them look dull. I was like,
Mhm.
how do I make this image pop? So I watched a lot of YouTube videos. I just typed in how to make your images pop. And there's a couple things that popped up. Number one, you can boost the vibrance in your colors too. Like for example, like any editing program from Instagram to things built into like iPhones or Androids and more, they always give you some options to do some like rudimentary edits. And one of the things you can change is the vibrancy of the colors. So one of the things I always do is I just make my colors more saturated, more vibrant too. And I think a lot of people they don't really envision how their pictures can look because they don't know what necessarily to do. So I've taught many people, hey, if you want to make this image of you look better, just make the colors more saturated. So that's one thing I do too. And one way to make your images more vivid and make them pop a lot more is just to make the colors more saturated. Number two, just add a lot more, contrast to your images as well. And I know that these may sound like very advanced, photographic terms coming from a photographer, but it's actually pretty simple too. Imagine you have a flat image where you have no contrast, no shadows, nothing. It just looks like a regular two-dimensional image, Okay. But one of the things that I learned in the YouTube video that I watched that still motivates my work to this day is that you want your images to have a sense of dimension to them. You want them to feel three-dimensional. You want to feel as though there's actual depth in the image. And one of the best ways you can do that is by adding contrast. And you can add contrast through light, having shadows, stuff like that to help contour the face. You can do stuff like, color contrast as well. Let's say that, most colors can be separated into warm or cool. So you can have color contrast where, maybe a color that's hitting your subject is warm, but the colors behind them are cool. So for me, it's about, adding, vibrancy. It's about adding contrast, but it's also about, taking light sources in the image, whether or not it's a neon light, a street lamp, a regular sign, or anything like that, and really just bringing those lights out, making them a lot more bright, a lot more prominent, and more. And I do that through a combination of, editing skills, but at the same time, using certain programs that have definitely elevated my work. So I guess when it comes to making your images pop, there's a lot of different things I can say, but it's not necessarily about making them pop, but it's rather just making sure they don't look flat and two dimensional. So
Mm. So how do you, when you're trying to make them three-dimensional, how do you do it without making it overblown?
mhm,
Basically, do you try to do 50-50 where you do some stuff like the lighting you mentioned before
mhm,
beforehand, so you already have stuff that makes it three-dimensional
mhm.
before you have to edit it? Or do you focus more on editing afterwards?
Yeah, the thing about me too, that's a great question. So I think a lot of people, especially photographers who shoot in studios, they have a lot of the same like philosophies that I do. They want to avoid their images looking flat, stuff like that. So they have like lights set up, stuff like we have in the studio right now too. But for me, I don't use flashes. I don't use external artificial lighting, anything like that in my photography. It's always just me and my camera, and that's it. So one of the things like you have to do is number one, you have to at least have your image initially in a place where you could bring out that level of contrast. So I try to pay attention to light sources. I try to make sure that there's contrast already in the base image, whether or not it's, light hitting from the side or, interesting colors in the background. So basically, I just like to have a good foundation for an image when I take it. Because, obviously there's a lot of editing that goes into my images. Like, if you try to go to the locations I shoot at and try to find the places where I took some of my shots, you would be surprised just how much I put my images through. But yeah, I like to get a good foundation where I do pay attention to things like lighting, contrast, color, composition, and more. But when it comes time to, obviously bring out that, vibrancy, and when it comes time to bring out that contrast, that definitely takes a level of like editing skill as well. So one of my secrets, at least, that I have never shared before is, a lot of photographers edit their pictures in Adobe Lightroom. It's the go-to default 99% of photographers use it. That's not what I use to edit my pictures. I use Lightroom maybe for like 20% of my editing process. I actually use this editing program called Luminar Neo, which basically it's like an AI editing program where it allows you to do things to your images that would otherwise take you multiple steps in a program like Lightroom and Photoshop. So anytime that I want to bring out the lights in my images, if I want to add some more contrast, if I want to make them have like more boom or make them bombastic, there are certain sliders within Luminar Neo where they allow you to do just that too. So things that otherwise took me a long period of time having to move, different settings and Lightroom and stuff like that. Using Luminar Neo, I just have to move a slider and it does it for me. So yeah, it's about having a good foundation when you take the image initially and then knowing how you want to edit it
Does that
afterwards.
AI app have any prompts or is it just sliders?
Oh yeah, no, it definitely takes some skill too. So like it's basically how it kind of works is that for example, there is a slider with an app called Glow. That's how they called it. And basically, if you move it to the right, what it does, it automatically adds a lot of contrast to your image. It brings out the lights in the image, makes them a lot more, vibrant, large, glow. Essentially, that's a word I'm looking for too. So basically, it's not something that edits your images for you, but rather it allows you. It picks up on certain like variables, a certain like how do you say,
Basically, whatever you're thinking, it helps you put that into the photo. So if you're
yeah.
envisioning a certain look,
Hmm.
it's gonna help you go for that goal.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that as a photographer, downloading Luminar Neo or when I started using it was probably the biggest decision I've made in my photography career. It's really what's allowed my images to pop a lot more, over the last couple months too. So yeah, just getting back to it, just taking the image, being able to, identify the different elements within the frame, whether not it's like light, color, composition, stuff like that. And then what I generally do is I get that good foundation when I'm taking the image, but I already know how I probably want to edit the image while I'm there. And then afterwards, I'll take it home, put it through its paces, edit the image and get to where I want it to be. So yeah, I would say for me, it's half, taking a good image initially and half being a, inspired editor. So.
So I want to go back to the lighting you mentioned earlier. When
Mhm,
you're with that model or you're
mhm.
in that spot, when do you decide to move them, or when do you decide to move yourself to where you have less natural lighting, or you have a better idea of how to make it 3D?
Mhm. Yeah, and so this is actually a good question too. So my first camera I have ever had was a Sony A6000. Basically, it's a camera that came out in 2013. So it's a great camera, very competent in a lot of situations. But something that it does struggle in is low lighting. So try to go to any situation where it's like nighttime or anything like that. So
That's
it's strong.
interesting because that's like most of your. I feel like it's a lot of your places.
Yeah, so as you may expect, because of the limitations of my camera, I had to become a better editor to overcome that.
Mm.
So something I picked up onto, and I found this in a YouTube video. And I remember what this guy said. He said that if you are trying to make your images more three dimensional, one of the things you want to make sure you do is you want to have light wrap around the face. So let's say, for example, I face directly towards this light in front of me right now. It's hitting me straight on. It's okay. My entire face is illuminated right now. So that looks great. It looks okay. But I turn my head a little bit like this. So, I have some shadows on this side and I have light coming from this side. So I've introduced a certain level of like lighting contrast in my face. And what this YouTube video essentially said is that the more contrast you have when it comes to light wrapping around the face, the more dimensional your image is going to look. Like for example, if you've ever looked at any painting from the 1700s or the 1800s, you may you always notice that the subjects within these paintings have lighting coming from a light source either from the left or from the right. It's rarely just an image where they hit directly head on. Part of the reason why that happens is that a lot of painters realize that painting is inherently a two-dimensional art form, but yet they still wanted their images to have a sense of depth. And one of the best way you can add depth to an image is by having that contrast. And contrast in this situation being tasteful shadows, while at the same time having highlights and more. So when I started taking pictures out during nighttime, I realized that I needed to illuminate my subject. So, like for example, if I would go and do a photo shoot in an arcade, even with how limited my camera was, I was like, okay, can I have my subject stand closer to like an arcade cabinet? So there's at least some illumination hitting them on the face too. So what ended up happening in those situations is I was able to identify light sources in the environment that could use to illuminate my subjects. But at the same time, because it's a singular light source, it's not going to be covering the entirety of her face too. So there's going to be some parts of her face that are going to be covered in the shadows. I think a lot of photographers are afraid of that. They want their subjects to be perfectly illuminated. But something about that really spoke to me too, because I'm like, oh, that adds like a level of mystery or intrigue to my images too, but also adds a level of contrast. It just makes it look like it has a lot more depth too. So I think that that's one of the things I really focused on when it came to going into these situations, low lighting and bringing my subjects with me, is that compared to other photographers, I'm not afraid of darkness. I'm not afraid of shadows. In fact, I think that it's a pretty major part of my work at this point because the darker the shadows, the brighter the highlights seem. And I think that's what I really am focused on too. So I think that leaning into that contrast, leaning into that dimension into my work was not something I actually did intentionally at first. It's just the fact that I love to take pictures during nighttime and I had to take advantage of the light sources around me. But as I started to do that, as I started becoming more aware of where light was coming from, whether that was coming from fluorescent lighting above you or arcade cabinet or street lamp, I started to notice that there was a lot of shadows and contrast in my image that helped to give my work a sense of like mystery and intrigue to it, far beyond maybe some of my other peers. So I leaned into that too, and I started to notice that, oh, that has helped my images to, I hate to go back to the same word, have a lot more depth to it. But I guess like the last example I can give is, imagine that you're outside on a cloudy day, and you know how it is on a cloudy day, like there's a light coming from all around you too, like compared to maybe like sunset where the main light source outside is coming from the sun and it's coming from one direction. During a cloudy day, you have light coming from everywhere. So the light is really diffused, stuff like that. In those situations like that, the lighting is soft, but it's not exactly, contrasty because you're in
Yeah.
your entire face. But when you take pictures during the sunset, though, yeah, you have that singular light source, and that adds that level of like contrast. I think the best word to use for it is like it makes the images seem more dramatic. That's why a lot of photographers like to take pictures during sunset too, because not only does it look beautiful too, but having that singular light source coming from a single direction in the sky helps the images to have more contrast, have more dimension, makes them seem more dramatic, and the ultimate word is it helps your images to seem a lot more interesting.
And it's a sweet spot where it's not too bright, not too
Mhm.
dull, to where you can actually see. I feel like you can see emotion when
Yeah,
there's sunset or sunrise, where it's like, okay, this gives a certain energy to it, and that's why people like that more.
yeah, exactly. Certain environments, certain lighting conditions, certain weather conditions inherently evoke like more profound emotions from us than others. Like for example, let's say that I took a picture of someone on a white wall. That's it. Like, and say like I was taking like a yearbook picture for them and when they were in middle school. Yeah, you're not gonna feel very emotional looking at that image. But let's say I take a picture of them instead during sunset. Sure, like, that will be inherently more interesting to people. It will make them feel a lot more emotional because the sun, sunlight, nighttime stuff like that. Those are settings that have been culturally imbued within us to make us feel certain types of emotions. And I think that that's what I try to go after in my work. I realize that certain lighting conditions, certain compositions, certain, locations have a tendency to evoke a wonder and intrigue. And I think that's something I really try to lean into in my work.
What locations or lightings do you look for to add that emotion?
Yeah, I would say that for me, like I said before, one of the things I really lean into is a sense of mystery and intrigue in my work. And one of the best ways to do that is to have your work be on the darker side. Because there's a lot of photographers out there who take pictures in parks, during well lit days, pictures of families, stuff like that too. And you wouldn't necessarily call those images mysterious. You would say they were beautiful, that they were elegant, that they were great pictures, but you wouldn't say that they evoke a level of intrigue from you. For me, though, what I typically look for is, I think the word to describe it is ambience. Like, is there a sense of
Mm.
mood or ambience in the situation I'm in? Like, of course, like arcades have that sense of like mood and ambience. Like, can you walk into a situation and feel as though, oh, there is something about this place that evokes a sense of like profound emotion in me?
It's
And
like
I,
excitement, joy, or curiosity when you're looking around at
yeah,
all the different games and all the lighting.
exactly. And my goal as a photographer is not only to find those places, but also bring them out during my editing process. So, things I look for is like, are there interesting lights in the situation? Are there interesting textures around too? Are there interesting, monuments or places to look at in the environment? And even if there's not, because I think a lot of people would tell you, like, I posted a photo shoot at Target like a couple weeks ago too. But people were like, how did you turn Target into something that interesting? And it really just turns out like I walked into Target, I was like, okay, I see these lights, I see the fluorescent lighting. I think I can change them to make them look more interesting too. So it's not only about what you see in the environments, it's also about the potential you see too. And that's something that's harder to teach. That's why I think a lot of people are genuinely like kind of like surprised by the locations I go to. Because one thing I forgot to mention about myself is that I rarely shoot in the same place twice. So I'm always going to unique locations and more. And I think that people, when they ask me how do I shoot or edit my images, they always like, oh, what do you look for, what do you pick up on? But a large part of my artistic process is also about the potential I see in a location, and that potential really comes from what inspires you, what do you envision. I think that's a little bit harder to share. I think there are people who are inspired by different things. I already described that I'm inspired by cyberpunk, anime, interesting, interesting locales, mystery, stuff like that. And I think that there are people who are inspired by other things. So yeah, I think that's really the process when I'm looking for locations, interesting environments, looking for a place that has like a mood, a theme, a sense of ambience where, you walk in and you feel something. And my job as the artist is to bring out that feeling even more. So,
When you're looking for that location,
mhm,
what locations have you seen where you saw the potential and it turned out great, and then the ones where you assumed it would be great
mhm.
and it turned out being negative or bad, like it didn't look as good as you thought it would?
Yeah, I say that this is actually kind of interesting too, because I think that despite, obviously the struggles at when it comes to being a creative person, I think I've largely done a pretty great job in the majority of the locations I've shot at for bringing out the potential. So I would say that I haven't experienced a lot of situations where I envisioned something and it didn't turn out at least somewhat interesting. But there have definitely been certain locations that I've shot at that I was like, ooh, yeah, I feels like I've done a lot better. But I think a lot of that stemmed not from the actual location itself, but rather me being a normal human being, making some mistakes and issues during the editing process. Like, for example, when it comes to how I edit my images, as you like said, there's a lot of vibrant colors, bright lights. There's a lot of very important variables in my images, and can be very easy for my images to be overwhelming, to be very muddy, very confusing and more. So one of the things I have to really prioritize is having a sense of balance in my images. You want them to be interesting, you want them to be bombastic, but you still want them to be easy to look at. You don't want people to be, confused about where the subject is, stuff like that. And there have been some times, understandably, where, maybe give an example, like, oh yeah, I did a photo shoot at a church recently that posted to my Instagram. It was a beautiful location, like almost like a cathedral of sorts. And I knew how I wanted my images to look. However, one of the things I struggled with during the editing process was balancing the colors. And this is a more technical aspect of photography that I understand that, non-photographers might not be able to understand, but color is not only huge in how interesting the image is, but it's also incredibly important when it comes to balancing an image. So, that will take a while for me to explain, but I didn't feel as though I did the best job of balancing the colors in the image. I feel as though some of the pictures I took were too orange. I think that because of how orange the images looked, I didn't really bring out the subject as much as I was wanting to. So, my subject, she was one of my friends, Morgan, too, and I really, in my mind, envisioned a cinematic shoot. And I think I know that mostly, but I realized that for me to get close to my vision, I had to have a certain level of like editing, I guess you can say, skill that I had to balance. And I think there was a couple images where trying to get closer to my vision, I made a couple missteps when it came to balancing the images. And one of the main things you want to do when you're taking pictures of others is you want them to stand out. You want the subject of the picture, the person you're taking the image of, to stand out. And I didn't do the best job of that. So that just goes to show that, even when I see potential in an environment, I still need to be careful that I'm not overwhelming the viewer, and that I have enough taste when it comes to my editing process, and make sure that my subject, the main focal point of the image, still stands out. So yeah, it just shows that even with my progress, I'm still learning. I'm still trying to get better.
Were the colors too similar, or was it just a lot of
Mhm.
muted colors? Was it like a lot of
Yeah. So I would say like a lot of the colors were a little bit too similar. Like the inside of the church was very orange, stuff like that too. And like a lot like churches are, they have that ambient orange glow, things like that too. But the thing is, a lot of black people also have a lot of orange in their skin too.
mhm.
That's one of the things you have to pay attention of when you're taking pictures of black people as well. So when you're in a location that is very orange intense and you have a person there, you really want to make them, pop out. And I usually do a good job of that too, but I felt in this, particular situation, I didn't balance the oranges as well as I normally do. I just feel as though, I don't really know what happened. I don't usually make that mistake too often. But I think it was a good experience though, because it taught me that I still have a long way to go. But yeah, there are certain environments where certain colors, whether or not in the actual environment or like a tint in the entire image, are prominent. And when you're taking pictures of people, you want to make them stand out. So you have to be aware of how those colors interact. it's a skill that I had to learn over the course of a couple months, and it's something that a lot of non-photographers don't really notice because it's our job as photographers to take an image and make it look convincing immediately. There's a lot of people who don't recognize the level of effort and balance and vision that goes into an image. Like they just see a cool image on Instagram, they click heart and they just keep it pushing. But yeah, I think the issues that I'm describing in the photo are things that I don't think anyone knows. But as a person who tries to hold himself to a high standard, I suppose there are still things I need to get better at.
How do you keep that in mind now, based on when you're looking for things like that? Do you try to choose more carefully for the skin tone
Mhm.
or like the surrounding area? And do you basically, with that, do you try to find the right spot for them based on that skin tone? Or are you just like, ah, I'll figure it out once I get there? Or do you figure it out before?
You know what? I usually just figure out when I get there because, like I said, what happened with the church was a very rare occurrence. I think
Mm,
I've
okay.
done enough due diligence as a photographer and editor that I've been able to make pretty much any skin tone work in any situation. Mostly because, compared to maybe some other photographers too, I have a general goal of mine where I try to take pictures in every single spot of any location I'm in. Like for example, when I go to an arcade too, I like to take pictures with all the arcade cabinets, make them look interesting. So what that means is that generally I'm rarely, if ever, taking a picture in the same exact, lighting color conditions. Like sure, I may be going to a single location, but what I found as a photographer is that there are a lot of different unique spots in each location that I go to as well. So because of that, there may be certain images in the location I'm in where the lighting might be tough and I need to balance it a little bit more. But generally, there's enough, you know, variability and there's enough, diversity in the locales in the specific location that it's not a struggle that I experience with most of the images in most locations I'm in. Like I'm aware of the skin tones, and as long as I, keep that in mind when I'm editing, I'm usually able to get through it pretty fine. So that's a skill I definitely had to work for.
Do you find How do you find the dull spots in those locations? If you're shooting everywhere,
Mhm,
how do you make those? I guess to me, I'd see those as boring spots in
mhm.
that area. So when you're shooting everywhere, how do you find those spots to make them interesting?
Yeah, I think this is when editing comes to life too. So, for example, let's say that you go out and you take pictures of someone in the middle of a street. It's during the day. There's nothing really that interesting to nothing that really stands out. I think for a large amount of people, that would just be of like a regular image, like something you might post to your Instagram story, something like that. Nothing too prominent. But for me, though, and like I kind of alluded to beforehand, these spots that look dull and boring from the outset are things that I see potential in. Like, for example, can I make the colors more saturated? Can I make the image pop a lot more? Can I add that sense of contrast, subject background separation? Can I add like a sun flare in the background? Of course, through editing and more too. Like, can I like color grade the image to make it look like a movie? Something like that too. I think that that's something that I have spent a lot of time in where even when I see a dull spot, I think that I've done a good job of not only, cultivating my specific vision, but also having the editing chops to extract something interesting out of that environment. Like if you told me to like go into like, for example, a subway and take an interesting picture, yeah, I probably could do it, but it will be a little bit harder than maybe, in downtown Dallas.
Yeah.
But I think that for me, if I'm in a particularly dull, uninspired, or uninteresting situation, I really lean on my particular vision and my editing savviness to bring that out. So that's a process that I go through. So there's a reason why, when I post a photo shoot to my Instagram, people are like, wow, those images look cool. Then they go to the actual location and it's like, wow, that looks
How'd you do
nothing like
this?
that. I'm like, man, that's what I do. I'm a professional catfisher. So yeah, that's what I really lean into.
What movies or anime inspire like your vision, your theme?
That is a great question. So I would say like, where to start? Like stuff like Ghost in the Shell,
Mm.
Akira, you know, let's see, Cowboy Bebop, of course, even like Cyberpunk 2077, some more examples too.
But those still all lean pretty close to that cyberpunk, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah,
They all have elements of
mm,
it in them,
yeah,
some more than others.
yeah, exactly. And I think that when I say that too, I think a lot of people like, okay, that means that his entire Instagram is just like pinks and teals and stuff like that. Yeah, sure. Like a lot of my shoots lean into that aesthetic, but I think it's not only about what the locations look like on the surface. It's also about the moods that they evoke. Like, for example, if you watch like a cyberpunk anime, and you see them walking through a grimy street at night, where the only like major light sources are coming from like neon lights and more. Those are the types of feelings I try to evoke in my work as well. So it's not only about the aesthetic of how these cyberpunk animes look like, but it's also about the moods and the intrigue and the mystery that they evoke as well. And so I think it's a multi-dimensional type of thing that inspires me as well too. And I think that even when I'm taking pictures of like a family outdoors, during sunset too, I still try to evoke that level of like mystery as well. So I do that by sun flares, interesting lighting choices and more. So yeah, it's those types of situations really inspire me. There's a reason why like teal and magenta are some of my favorite colors. So
Yeah, I'd say it's even more impressive that you've figured out how to make those shoots that don't have the neon lights or don't have that lighting. They still have that similar mood.
hmm
So the ones with the lighting, it's very vibrant, but you still have that moody, grimy feeling in the other ones as well,
hmm
which is crazy to think. 'Cause I can't even imagine how long that takes.
yeah, it's crazy too because I think when people think like when they look at my work, they're like, okay, yeah, when Ty approaches a location or he approaches a photo shoot, he has a specific, idea in mind. The thing is like, no, I wing almost all my photo shoots. I don't have a vision board. I don't have a Pinterest board. I don't have anything. I really just go off my artistic intuition. I think that, even despite the diversity in the locations that I shoot at, sometimes being during the day, during the night, in arcades and department stores and more, there are general philosophies that I carry with me that allow my images across all these different locations to at least have a certain consistent through line. Number one, I like to add contrast. Number two, I like to add, vibrant colors or at least interesting colors. Number three, I like to add some level of color grading. Or number four, I like to focus on interesting lighting. So I think that that's something that you can accomplish in the majority of locations. I managed to do it in a Target. So yeah, if I can do it in Target, then I could probably do it in other places too. So
With the shoots that are more
mhm,
dull,
mhm.
when you bring a model along with you, how do you get them to feel comfortable, or how do you get them to trust the process of what you envision? Because they're like, say
Mhm.
they are at Subway, and they're like, okay, how are we gonna make this work?
You know, that actually has sometimes been a struggle too, because a couple months ago, one of the Facebook photography groups I was in had this like huge group chat where you could reach out to models and ask them, "Hey, who wants to shoot here?" And sure, there was a couple times that I said, "Hey, who wants to do a photo shoot at IKEA?" And a lot of people were like,
Oh, IKEA,
I was like, "What
why?
the heck?" And then, obviously I do the photo shoot at IKEA, post it, and everyone's like, "What the heck? That's an IKEA? Oh, that looks great." So, yeah, no, that can definitely be a struggle in getting people to like buy into the process. But I think that I've done enough. I think I've done a good enough job at this point of building my reputation within the DFW that
Oh, for
I
sure.
think I think that people come up to me and they just inherently trust me. And
Mhm.
so if someone's reaching out to me to do a photo shoot, they already have a pretty good idea about my capabilities. So I haven't really experienced as much about them, struggling. They just, like oftentimes they just say, "Hey, just do your thing. Just tell me where to stand, and I trust you." And I think that's something I'm very humble and I'm very grateful for because I know when I was first starting out doing photography, I could barely get anyone to buy into my specific vision. So it's mostly just my friends, my my close ones, my loved ones, and stuff like that. But yeah, it's a level of trust and a level of reputation that I had to earn over the course of 2 years. So yeah, I'm very very grateful for my friends. Shout out to like Dejana, shout out to Thea, shout out to Bethany, who were my go-to models for the first year that I was doing photography since it was still hard to get people to go to me to interesting locations. But
Yeah.
now, I think that I've expanded the zeitgeist. People like, okay, maybe a photo shoot at an arcade would actually be kind of cool too. So, yeah, I'm grateful for it.
So before the proof was in the pudding, when you didn't have those friends,
Mhm.
how'd you make the models who didn't know you, who weren't friends and family comfortable?
I'm gonna be straight up honest. Tinder. Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, no, definitely. When I was first starting out, of course, when I arrived to Dallas for the first time, one of the best ways to meet new people is like through dating apps and stuff like that. And I think that I was fortunate enough that I wasn't like cream of the crop. I wasn't top 5%, but I had enough consistent, matches and stuff like that to meet with people too. And I think a lot of ordinary people have never had a professional picture taken of them outside like the obligatory graduation shoot or stuff like that too. So I think that if they just see a person with a semi-professional looking camera too, they're like, "Oh yeah, please take a picture of me too." So I think that that in itself wasn't that hard to get people to buy into. Like just tell them, "Hey, you want to take some pictures with my fancy A6000?" Of course, it wasn't really that fancy, but they had no idea. They don't know anything about cameras. But yeah, sure. But yeah, definitely had to do a little bit more convincing to convince them to come with me to like a library and stuff like that too. So yeah, it was a struggle. But before I had my friend group, when I moved to the DFW, a lot of it was through just like dating apps or maybe meeting people out in the world. But
Okay, so was that a first date thing, or you're like, okay, like I know them a little bit, and
mm,
then I'm gonna go?
sometimes it was a first date thing, and sometimes it was a little bit afterwards too. I don't know. Like I'm fortunate enough that I'm a pretty decent communicator too,
Yeah.
so I can communicate myself well enough that I can get them to agree to it. But that wasn't the main reason why I was hanging out with them. I just said, "Hey, I'm a photographer," and they're like, "Oh, cool, let's take some pictures." So yeah, it's sometimes a first date thing, sometimes it was a third date thing, but that period where I was relying on dating apps was only like for about 2 or 3 months before I really found my friend group. I was like, okay, I don't have to lean onto these apps as much anymore. So short amount of time.
During that time, what was the most interesting shoot you did when you were?
You know what? The most interesting shoot I did was actually my first arcade shoot ever. So it was actually my first photo shoot I ever did that actually blew up on social media. So I went to this arcade called Andy B's in Denton, Texas. Just your general typical arcade and stuff like that, bowling alley. But this is when I really started to feel some semblance of confidence in myself as a creative person because I wasn't the best editor. I wasn't anything like that. But what I did have was a vision and a way of composing my images that given the already unique aesthetic of the environment, I was able to take some cool looking pictures, even though I wasn't that skilled in a lot of aspects of photography. But the thing is, the fact that I even had some level of intentionality or inspiration behind my images. I didn't just like put her in front of a arcade cabinet and just told her to pose it. Like I played with angles, I shot through things, stuff like that too. When I posted that photo shoot on like the Facebook photography groups and Instagram, it blew up. It got a lot of likes, it got a lot of engagement, it had a lot of people commenting under the post or messaging me directly through Instagram asking, "Hey, I would love to sit down. You can teach me how you like edited these images or how you took these images and more," which caught me off guard because I thought that I was like an amateur at the time. But that was my first inclination that even though you may not have all the skill sets in that particular craft, if you have at least some level of inspiration that shapes your work, then there will be people out there who want to buy into it. So yeah, that's what happened. I posted that arcade shoot, did very well, and I was like, okay, I at first I didn't know where I was really going with this, but there's something here for me to grow into.
So was it the feedback from other people, or was it like a combination of that and you actually
Mm,
putting your plan into motion and then saying, oh, okay, this is how I envisioned it, and it's coming pretty close to how I envisioned it?
yeah, I think that of course at the time I wasn't fully aware of just how good my images could become, but I think that that photo shoot that I did at the arcade, it got pretty close to the vision that I wanted. I of course looking back at it now, I'm like, ooh, yeah, some of those images weren't that great. But of course, it's been 2 years now.
Yeah, you're way better now. So
Yeah,
it's like,
but back then, there was definitely some images I took there that I was like, oh, these are some good shots. Heck, one of the images I took there, I actually did some level of editing too. I had to like watch a 15-minute YouTube video to understand how to even use Lightroom in that type of way. But it's still one of my favorite images I've ever taken, and it still holds up, which is not something I can say about a lot of my initial photo shoots. And yeah, I was actually confident in the work, but I didn't really expect it to blow up or anything like that. Because like the other photo shoots I posted didn't light the world on fire. But it was the first time I ever did a photo shoot that I was proud of, that other people around me were also proud of too. And I was like, okay,
it's like now we're on the same page.
we're on the same page now, and like we're still on the same page going forward. Of course, even nowadays, there are times where I do a photo shoot that I'm really happy about, that I'm really proud of. I was like, oh man, like this is some of my best work. But then you post it on Instagram, you know how Instagram is, like doesn't show it to your followers, or you post it to Facebook and people don't see it. Yeah, so I think that there are times where even nowadays I'm like, oh man, I really wish that this shoot did better. Like, but still, like having that first moment where I did a great job. I know I did a great job, and it actually did well was a level of external affirmation that I really needed. Because not only did it do well on the Facebook photography groups, it did much better than what most posts do. Like some of these groups, the average amount of likes and engagement are like maybe like five, six, seven. I got like 80, which is a metric ton in some of these groups. So yeah, I think it's a push and motivation I really needed. So I look back on that shoot pretty fondly.
What other apps would you recommend, or you just stick to Instagram for photography? Because I know there's some other ones
Mhm.
that are around there, but I just don't go to those since that's not my main thing.
Yeah, I think that Instagram's a good enough app for the vast majority of people. There are other apps based around like photography and more that are useful, but I think they're really made for photographers in mind, not just general people. Like,
So it's a photography's fan club, but not for.
yeah, apps like Behance, which is owned by Adobe too, it gives photographers a chance to like share their work, be inspired by the work too, but it's not made in mind to be an explicit social media platform like
Hmm.
Instagram too, and it's really a photography centric platform. I think that even now I'm still looking for opportunities to find apps and find places to connect with other photographers and more because I've had many people ask me, "Oh, wait, Ty, you must be well connected. You must be going to all these groups, organizations. You must have all these different apps that you're building your community around." But I'm like, I'm just using Facebook and Instagram, and yeah. So I would say like right now, like apps like Behance are pretty good. Of course, Pinterest as well too. Like I post some of my images to Pinterest, and now they have like thousands of downloads. I'm like, I never thought I would have a Pinterest account. I was like, oh, I'm not like a white woman in college, but
It's
still
still
making it work.
working.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I would definitely say Instagram is good for the majority of people, even though I'm not a big fan of the app at times, just because, like I said, I work hard on the photo shoot, post it, and most of my followers don't see it. But I think it's in those moments that you have to have a certain level of resiliency and be like, you may not always have that level of engagement. You may not always have, that external affirmation that you need. But if you feel like you're growing, that does matter. But yeah, I'm definitely in the process of trying to grow my audience and hopefully get to 2,000 followers sometime soon.
With those downhills where you see no engagement, other than understanding that you're still growing and you're working on your craft, how do you
Mhm.
keep like on the long haul focused?
I think that's also realizing there's a lot of things you just can't control. Like, for example, one of the biggest things that determines, whether or not one of my photo shoots does well is how much people like the initial image. For every photo shoot I post to Instagram, I always post a max amount of photos allowed per post, which is 10. And one of the hardest parts about posting a photo shoot for me is determining like what image is going to be the first one. Because if someone's not interested enough in the first image they see, they're not going to swipe through the other, nine. And there are times where I've gotten that first image right. I was like, oh yeah, this is clearly the best image. And there are times where I have chosen wrong. And so I think that in those situations, I'm choosing what I think is the best, but it might be different than what my audience thinks. So how Instagram kind of works too, and this is what I found out for like research as well, is that when you post to Instagram, they will determine how far they're going to push your post within based on how much engagement you get within the first couple hours. So
Hmm.
generally the first 1 to 2 hours. If you're not getting a lot of engagement within the first 1 to 2 hours, they're not going to focus on pushing your post to as much of your followers as they would with a post that does pretty well. So for example, I was like, I'm able to tell at this point that if my post doesn't get a certain amount of likes within the first 1 to 2 hours, I'm like, okay, this one is going to be one that's not going to perform as well compared to another one. So there are certain metrics you can use to be like, okay, yeah, this is going to tell me. But there's also a lot of things about, oh, how many of your followers are online at a certain amount of time, or are they invested in the first image that they see out of the like 10 images you post per shoot? And I think that with all those different variables I can't control, I think it sucks when I work hard on a photo shoot and it doesn't do well. And it does, I do think about it a lot, but at the same time, I know that there's a lot of variables that go into the algorithm at Instagram, also with the behaviors of my followers that I just can't control. So that's why I'm trying to just expand my audience and hopefully, get to the point where I'm having that level of engagement more consistently. So yeah.
Yes, I've noticed that there's plenty of people where I love their craft, I love their shoots, I love their photos, and then I'll look around like, oh, this is like 2 or 3 days ago. Then all
Yeah.
of a sudden I'm finally seeing it. So I basically have to if I really like people's stuff, I have to like search for their name
Mhm.
because otherwise I'm not gonna see it until days later.
Yeah, and exactly. Like I'm so sympathetic to it too, because even like I want like anyone who's watching this to like hop on your Instagram right now and just scroll through your feed and notice just how many of the initial posts you're going to see are going to be ads. It's going to be from companies, you know,
Ads and reels,
yeah,
baby.
preferred accounts that Instagram shares with you. Like how long it takes you to swipe before you actually start seeing your followers' content more consistently. And notice how like they only show you a certain sliver of your followers. Like they're not going to show you, accounts all across your, follower spectrum. They're only going to show you the 10 accounts they think that you want to see. I miss the days like, 6, 7 years ago where Instagram actually had a chronological feed where you're not seeing posts from like 5 days ago but you're actually seeing posts from 5, 10 minutes ago. But those days have passed and I think that's just reality now.
I wonder what they choose or how they engage, how they pick what your engagement means. 'Cause it's like there's certain things that I like that has nothing to do with my followers, but I
Hmm.
still enjoy it, so I'll throw that stuff too. But I want both.
Hmm.
Like I enjoy getting the random shit that's oh I actually do like this or oh I find this funny,
Yeah.
but I still want to see the things that my followers are posting too.
Yeah. I honestly, I don't think Instagram's algorithm does that very well. I think that an app that does do it very well is TikTok. For example, I have like 16 followers on TikTok. I made my account very recently, but yet when I posted some of my reels, which are just like things I made for Instagram as well, they actually do very well. Like I get way more likes and views compared to my level of followers compared to Instagram, where I post that same exact reel and it underperforms. So I think that it also depends on how generous and understanding the algorithm is. I think TikTok does a great job of, picking up on what videos, what type of content you like to watch, but at the same time still supplying you like new things to see along with your followers. I don't think Instagram does a great job of that. And I think it's part of the reason why I'm just like there's just some aspects of the algorithm as a platform that I've just have to understand that's just not gonna be in my favor. And yeah,
Yeah, it feels like they're still throwing stuff at the wall, just seeing what sticks. Like, let's see.
always.
For you,
Mhm.
when you're going out there, what's one equipment like you feel like you have to have every time, other than your camera?
You know what? Outside my camera, I don't usually bring a lot more with me, but there's something I do use in my work that it's kind of like a secret weapon of mine that a lot of people don't know about. I use a prism in my work, like a crystal prism or stuff like that. So what a prism essentially does is like you hold it in your hand and it actually diffracts light too. So you put it in front of your camera, hold it in front of the lens, and any type of light source immediately in front of your camera will actually refract it. So it can cause some really cool lighting effects in your work, and I've done that a lot, especially in my arcade shoots. And it was one of the first things I ever used in my work where people were like, "Oh my gosh, how did you do that? That looks cool." And I think it just goes to show too that it's not only about how much skill you have when it comes to the existing programs and resources you use, it's also about the resources you use in general. So yeah, I usually bring a prism with me all the time too. Like if I see any sort of like cool lighting sign, neon sign, lighting source and more, I have a tendency to post my or put my, prism in front of my, lens and see what I can do. So outside of that, I don't usually bring much else with me too. It's usually just me, myself, and I and my camera. And
With the prism, are you always holding it in front of it? Or are you angling it like sometimes to the side of the lens? Or
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. The thing about the prism too is that there's not one set way to like hold or position it. Actually, like there's a lot of experimentation when it comes to changing the angle, how close you get away from it. Because that's one of the fun things about it too. You don't have consistent control over it, so sometimes it takes multiple attempts to get to an image that looks clean and interesting too. So yeah, really oftentimes when I use it, I just put it in front of my camera and just like turn it around until I have it looking somewhat cool too. And yeah, it's worked. It's secret thing that I use along with Luminar Neo, where people are trying to figure out how I get my images to look a certain type of way too, and I'm like, oh, I got some secrets, but
other than the prism,
Mhm.
is there anything else that you use occasionally that's like that? Where it's like, oh, this is fun sometimes to throw on my sheet.
Surprisingly enough, no, actually, it's crazy. Like I don't bring lighting with me. I don't bring any other toys, stuff like that. I actually did post a photo shoot today, actually, because I post every Sunday and Thursday, where I actually bought some unique filters for my camera, which like diffract light in very interesting ways. And I might start bringing those with me a little bit more too, because the photos I posted today looks gorgeous. It's one of my favorites that I've ever done. But outside like those filters I occasionally use with my camera, I don't bring anything else with me. No lighting, no RGB lights, nothing like that. In fact, I rarely if ever dictate what my models actually wear or anything like that. I just say, hey, just come wear whatever you want to, feel comfortable. So I'm definitely a very casual person like that, even though that casualness kind of catches people off guard, considering how my images look. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, photography for me is still very much a passion project. It's not anything I ever expected to grow as much as it did, but again, that's what happened.
Have you ever asked them like to wear a certain type of thing, like an outfit, like, oh, this would fit well with this, or is it usually just always winging it?
I think that the majority of the time I'm winging it. There are certain locations where I'm like, oh, if you have like a red shirt, maybe wear that a little bit too. But I most of the time like I trust the people I'm taking pictures of to know how they look best
Hmm.
and stuff like that. So I don't usually dictate it too much. And yeah, it hasn't burned me yet. I haven't had someone like show up in like a polka dotted dress when we're going to an arcade. So if that does happen though, that might become a little bit more strict. But
So, what photographers inspire you?
yeah, one of the photographers that well this I'll start with a couple like so when it comes to like my neon low light prism photography, there are two photographers I really enjoy a lot. One of them, his name is 19 Tones, so like number 19 in tones. He's actually the guy who really got prism photography really started to the one person who really started the whole like using a prism, using a crystal to bend light. He started it years ago actually. He calls it prism photography. I think that's what it's called too. And he is definitely one of my major inspirations. His account on Instagram is literally just called 19 Tones. So you'll find him. He's huge inspiration too. I've talked to him a couple times. His work really helps me to bring out the level of creativity and vision in my work that I look for. And another like photographer I follow him, like he's actually Russian. His name is Alexander Kolnosov, and he takes images in a lot of the same locations that I do. He refracts light a lot of the same ways that I do too, but he is definitely still on a level that's far beyond me, which I'm trying to get at. But they both do a lot of like cool lighting, bending lights, stuff like that too, interesting locations, a lot of ambience, stuff like that, things that really speak to me. But when it comes to like photographers who are like creative in other ways too, like when it comes to adding special effects or stuff like that to the images. Like there are photographers like her name is Liquid Verve. That's what she that's what she calls herself too. She makes absolutely outstanding work. I actually bought her, editing program to learn how to edit like her. You have one of the most, famous photographers of all time. His name is Caleb. He has like millions of followers on Instagram too, and he makes some of the coolest images I've ever seen. And finally, the last photographer I can mention is the photographer I get compared to the most. His name is Brandon Wolfel. And if you are even remotely, you know, involved in the photography community, you know who he is. And he makes a lot of really beautiful, colorful cinematic photography. He was one who really, really leaned into like neon photography, especially, which helped put his name on the map. I have all his photo books. I get compared to him a lot. People assume that we know each other. So yeah, definitely those photographers.
So, would you say that last one was your number one? Like, that's the one you've taken the most from, or is just by chance, along with the other elements?
It's funny, like, it was actually by chance. I wasn't aware of him until, a couple months into my photography career, but it just happened that him and I aligned very closely in our work too. So I wouldn't say that he directly, inspired me at the beginning, but he definitely inspired me once I found him too. Like I have his photo books. I follow him all the time too. His work has definitely changed a little bit. It's definitely moved away from the type of content that I initially followed him for, but I'm happy that he's evolving as a photographer too. But yeah, no, definitely. I get compared to him a lot, and that's an honor for me considering just how outstanding of an artist that he actually is. So
Once you discovered him, was there any like key takeaways you got from his work or his books?
yeah, one of the things that he did is that he uses color in a very interesting way because before I came across his work, I usually would just like mess with the vibrancy of an image. I wouldn't really try to affect the hue or the luminance of an image because affecting the hue of a color, that's a huge skill set because if you don't know what the hue of a color is, it's basically the different types of shades of that color. So when it comes to green, it's like olive green, royal green, emerald green, stuff like that too. So every single color has its own unique variations, and we call that a hue essentially. So you may have a singular color, but different hues of that color can inspire different levels of emotion or intrigue. Like red has, that magenta too. And before I came across his work, I didn't really focus on that too much. It was like, oh, that's way too overwhelming. But what I noticed is that, when I came across his work, I was like, oh, I want to replicate some of the things that he does, but I couldn't get close to what he was doing just because his colors just looked different than mine. But then I watched a couple YouTube videos where they're like, oh, yeah, he's actually changing the hue of a color. Like he will change a red from like a deep saturated red to something like a lot more, pink and less saturated and a lot more luminance and more. So he had a lot more control and intentionality of his colors than I did. And I realized that if I wanted to be on his level, I had to take that level of control over my own work as well too. So that's one of the things I do in a lot of my work as well. I change the hue of the colors a lot to get close to where I wanted to be, and that's a skill set that helped him to separate himself from other photographers. And I think that dabbling in that skill set is something that has helped me to separate myself from other photographers. Because at the end of the day, it's about how much active control, intentionality, and vision do you have over your work. And it's a difference between taking a picture on your phone of a friend at a concert and be like, oh yeah, cool, like she's standing from like a cool sign, compared to like, oh, did you intentionally like frame her in a certain type of way to did you edit the image to give it like a certain type of tone or theme? That's what I try to dabble in. He had a level of control over his artistic process that I wanted to mirror, and that's what I do now.
So when you say control, you're thinking about like every element in that picture,
Yeah,
basically how you're framing them, how they're posing.
exactly. Yeah, and I think that that's a side of being an artist that is a little bit different than the technical side. Like, because you could get a camera, you could learn all the different settings, you can learn how to focus. Make sure that you have like a nice level of background blur and more. That's good. You know how to use a camera, but the more philosophical side of like becoming a good artist, what goes into taking a great image, what helps you to get closer to having more control over your work. That's different. And like you said too, like being aware of all the different elements or variables within the frame. And the more you're aware of those variables, the more comfortable you are to interact with them and to change them and to edit them too. So I spent a lot of time, similar to like what Brandon did at the beginning of his career, understanding all the different nitty gritty, the details, the elements within the frame. So when it came time for me to start becoming more intentional with my editing process, I was able to keep those elements in mind and just craft an image that's even closer to my vision than in the past. So yeah, definitely.
So when you're focusing on control for the model, what do you focus on to move them around? Like how do you frame them?
Mhm.
Where do you instruct them to go? Or what are you going for?
Yeah, so I think in my case too, because I do work with established models, but there's also a lot of people I work with who aren't established models. So one of the things you have to do is you have to make them feel comfortable. And what I usually do in those situations is I think that when people get a picture taken of them, they feel very artificial. They feel very fake. They feel like they have imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
essentially. Like they can feel comfortable. They can look in a mirror at home, and be like, "Well, damn, I look hot as hell, man." But it's like you put like a camera in front of them, like,
Oh shit, what do I
"Oh,
do?
what the fuck?" Yeah, and I think that I have to make them feel like they belong in front of the camera. So one of the things you do is just by giving them clear instructions. Like for example, one of the things I focus on is like helping them emote in the face too. One of the things I always say is that when you want to be more convincing in your facial emotions, you focus on your eyes. Like a
Mm,
lot of people think that showing emotions comes from how you like move your lips, like stuff like that. But there's a reason why you're able to tell what someone is feeling, even if they have a mask on, because you can tell how genuine their emotions are from their eyes. There's a difference between something like this and something like this.
where you see the
And
eyebrows raise, the eyes
yeah,
glow.
exactly. So that's the first thing I say is like if you want to feel more at ease, realize that the genuineness of your emotions comes from your eyes. Number two, just helping them to feel a little bit more dynamic in their bodies. Because one of the things you can see when someone feels uncomfortable in front of a camera is how s- you know static they are. How like they don't move around a lot. They have very closed body language. So I generally say things like, "Oh, spread your legs out a little bit more." Shoulder to shoulder, stuff like that. Really curve your body in some ways too. So like, maybe stick out a hip a little bit, turn your head a little bit more. Just make your body seem a lot more dynamic, a lot more, interesting at least too. So just making them feel a lot more aware and a lot more control of their bodies as well. And one of the things I also do as well too is I that helps them out is I don't tell them to look directly into the camera. So I usually ask them to look around because I want them to feel as though they're actually a part of a location. We're actually
Mm,
in an environment. So I don't want it to look like, oh, I'm just taking a simple picture of them. I want them to like look around and say like, oh, they're looking at something interesting that's right off a frame, which helps to contribute to the intrigue of my work. So I think that teaching them not only about how to feel comfortable within the frame, but also about what I'm trying to go for has done a pretty good job of helping them buy into my work even more than they already did, being there. So yeah, that's what I do. And also like I pay attention like how I frame them against the background, against different lighting sources and more. And like if I think of this cool lighting behind them, I'm gonna have them stand in front of it. So yeah, it's not only about the different variables and elements in the environment that I frame them against, but it's also about helping them feel comfortable in themselves, so they feel as though they actually belong there. So that's what I do.
how else would you make them feel like they belong?
I think that part of the reason why people struggle with modeling is they see magazines and they see like a lot of these models having very nuanced, very interesting looks in their faces. Like it's kind of hard to describe what they're emoting, but they're emoting something. And you see models like posing or walking in very interesting, but still very like ways that are
It's
not.
like bigger than life, but it seems natural.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that when people think of modeling or being in front of a camera, they feel as though they have to have that same level of energy.
Mm.
And when they feel as though they don't have that level of energy, they feel uncomfortable. Because I think a lot of times when a photographer takes a picture of a model, it's usually a lot in the same vein. You want them to do a lot of the same level of like larger than life, movements, poses that you see in magazines. But one of the things that really benefits me in my work is I don't have that expectation. I oftentimes just want my models to feel like actual subjects in an actual environment and more. Sure, there are times where I have them like do some intentional movements and motions, but it's never anything that's as out there as things you see in magazines too. And I think that having that more down to earth approach when it comes to my subjects has helped them to feel a lot more comfortable. It's also caught off guard a lot of the models I work with too, where they may be established models. They may work with other photographers where they're expected to take on that like magazine editorial vibe. And when I don't have them do that, they're surprised and sometimes pleasantly surprised because they're like, oh wow, I can just smile, be happy, interact with the environment and more. So yeah, like I said, despite the level of effort I put into my work, I definitely still like to have that down to earth type of vibe.
Yeah, I can see how it can help them loosen up because I've noticed that the photographers I work with the best that just mesh well is where I feel comfortable with them and we're just trying stuff. Like
Hmm.
we both have an intention of what we want to do, but in the long run we have a similar goal, but we're also just kind of winging it at the same time. Say, I want to do this, this, this. Okay. After that, let's just do whatever.
Yeah, and I think that helps too because like I said before, I don't go into my photo shoots with a specific, vision board. I just wing it. I just go to the environment, they look around, pick up on the different elements that intrigue me, and then we just go there. And I don't have them stay in one spot for too long. I usually get like 3 or 4 shots, within like 10 to 20 seconds, and just keep it pushing. There's a reason why like a lot of my photo shoots, not only when I post them to Instagram but also Facebook, every single one of the images look completely different. Like I know a lot of models when they work with photographers, they go to a certain location and they usually stay in like 1 or 2 spots, and then the photographer just has them do different poses and movements within those individual spots. I am not like that. I like to touch every spot of every location that I'm in too. So when I post to Instagram, I have a rule where every single one of the 10 shots have to look significantly different than the
Mm.
others. So I think it's also something that catches people off guard too, because when models work with me, they expect to just be in the same spot, just do the typical poses and stuff like that. No, we're moving around. We're going on an adventure. We're exploring the locations that we're in, and that's a fun process. I think that helps them to feel more comfortable as well too. So
And it helps it feel lived in.
yeah, exactly too. Like I don't want my clearly there's this level of like intentionality in my images and adventure and expedition that I think a lot of people are attracted to. So
And I think I want to close out with this
mhm.
for for models and for photographers. what's one thing as a beginner you think could help them just advance rapidly if they just focus on this one or two things
Mhm.
that'll improve them?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to becoming better in a particular craft, especially when it comes to like maybe like photography or modeling, there are two sides of becoming better that you have to be aware of. Number one is something like that I like to call craft, like the technical side of it. Like for example, when you are becoming a photographer, you have to learn how to use your camera. You have to understand the settings. If you are wanting to edit pictures, you have to learn what the different settings within your editing programs actually mean too. You have to learn how to focus. When it comes to modeling, you obviously have to learn how to feel comfortable emoting in the face, feeling like you belong in front of the camera. So those are the more technical baseline, level of skills and capabilities that you need to have. So you need to spend some time watching YouTube videos, learning how to develop these skills because the more you have a stronger grasp over these, technical foundations, the more easier it's going to be for you to be creative after the fact. But I would say like outside like learning these things that you need to do, there's also another side of it, like I alluded to beforehand, which is the philosophical side. Like what goes into, a good image or what goes into like being a good model. Like what are the different elements you have to pay attention to? What inspires you? What are you trying to replicate? What are you trying to bring out and more? That level, that side of things, what I like to call the art side or the side that inspires you, that's where you can really separate yourself from other people as well. Like, sure, anyone can get in front of a camera and do the same type of poses too, but what are the emotions? What are the thoughts? What are the vibes that you are inspiring from other people? And I think that if you're trying to become better, you need to learn the technical aspects of, your particular field. Of course, modeling might be a little bit different. I can't speak to that, personally, because I'm not a model, at least not all the time. But you need to have that technical side down so you can have the level of existing skills to be able to be creative. But after that, you need to really sit down and watch, YouTube videos, talk to other people about what goes into being good at this particular craft, what inspires you, what motivates you. Because in that you will find the level of forward path, the forward trajectory that you need to follow to become better and become greater. So that's what I did to become better. So
So seeing that knowledge and having the intention. That
yeah,
way, if you have a goal, then learning, taking steps like you mentioned with the YouTube videos where you're learning from them. You're like, okay, I have this problem. Let me go
mm,
look it up. I have this issue. It's like you're basically correcting where you want to go and
mhm.
fixing it from there.
Yeah, exactly. I'll say like the last thing I would say too is that there are certain aspects of like becoming better that we will struggle for months or even years. But what I found out, especially when I was in college as well, is that there's a lot of incredible, meaningful information that can change you fundamentally, not only professionally, but also personally and artistically. A lot of great insights you can get from just watching a 5 minute YouTube video. Don't struggle on something for months or years when you can learn about it by just sitting down and watching a YouTube video for 5 to 10 minutes. Your life can change from these videos. And I changed, like, I didn't even know what Luminario was until I just heard it was mentioned in a random YouTube video that was on following about a completely different subject. And now it's made me twice the photographer that I was even a year ago. So,
All right, sounds good, man. His Instagram will be in the details below. And live a life led with all regret. Take care.